Welcome to Conversations of Hope, shining light on the journey of healing from abuse and trauma. I'm Faith Ingraham of Speaking Truth in Love Ministries.
And I'm Michelle Viscuse from Journey Pink. As survivors and advocates, we're here to support, educate, and inspire. Whether you're a survivor of abuse, a friend, family member, or a professional working with survivors, this podcast is for you.
We're breaking the silence that allows abuse to thrive, offering insights for healing and tools for effective support.
Our goal is to create a safe community of understanding, healing, and hope for survivors and their allies.
Visit conversationsofhopepodcast.org for resources and more information. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Welcome to Conversations of Hope again. And today is our first in-person interview for Conversations of Hope. Michelle isn't with us today, but we have Dale Ingram, my husband. We also have Sarah Carr and her parents, Suzi and Rusty, with us today. And we're going to be discussing some different issues surrounding abuse and purity culture and all of those different things that the church needs to be aware of and deal with. So, Suzi and Rusty, I think I'll start with you two, and I'd just like you to share a little bit of your stories, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Faith. What I wanted to say to start was I wanted to thank both you and Dale for what you do through Speaking Truth in Love and how much support you have been for us. We are here because a little over 15 years ago, my husband and I participated in a program that Dale's brother, Gary Ingram, and his wife, Melissa, were part of. And we went through the program as participants. We became leaders and then coordinators. So we spent a lot of time in that program. But that was the first place I was able to sit with trusted, safe people to share my own story of childhood sexual abuse. And because of that, I started to really experience healing for the first time and be able to share my own story. So we had been at a conference with Gary and Melissa, and they had invited you and your ministry, and you shared your story, and I never forgot it. So when Sarah came to us and disclosed what had happened to her with her relationship and betrothal with the youth pastor and how he had abused her, I said immediately, I know who to call. And not only did I know who to call, but you guys responded and you were so supportive and understanding. And honestly, that was the only place that we felt support. Wow. So I am so grateful. And you're here now supporting Sarah. And I just am so thankful for that.
Thank you.
So I guess we begin with the purity culture and how at that time the church was talking about kiss dating goodbye. It talked about not going on dates and being alone and things like that. And so at that time, was 25 plus years ago now, that was the thing to do. And so it was being taught, in the church and by our youth leaders and pastors and things like that. Wow, that's great, right? We had young daughters and, to keep them pure and safe is ideal, right? Any parent wants that. When it came around to the courtship thing and, Sarah uses betrothal and that was it. I have a hard time saying that because it bothered me so bad. But the courtship was okay. Well, this is like a wait and see, all right? No touching, no dating, no being alone, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. As we start there, it just seemed like the place to be.
And we had a house full of teenagers. Sarah had an older brother. He was very popular at school. They were very involved with their church, having prayer meetings. They were witnessing at school. They were having their friends come to church. So it felt like a safe environment. And we also were in a small community where everybody not only knew everybody, but they were related. So when we moved to a larger church, we really were doing it because they had a big youth program and a dynamic youth pastor. And so we thought this was going to be a really healthy environment for them to grow and to get to know others and to have relationships with other people in their faith. I have a hard time saying, but we actually thought it was a good idea. We really did. We bought into it. And we did it with the idea that our kids were going to have a healthy relationship and not go through the heartache of dating and getting their hearts broken and the risk of pregnancy and all those scary things as parents, right?
Right.
And so I thought the church was going to be a safe place.
Yeah, I think there are so many that for generations have felt that way. You hear an idea that sounds good, and I think that if you've got a sexual predator, it doesn't matter what setting you put in it. He's going to use what he can to find someone to prey on. And if you've got good, godly people who care, even if some of the ideas or things may not be the best, it still can work out. But when the motives are bad to start with, but something that's doomed. And the thing with trust, most of us as Christians, instinctively, at least we used to, trust our pastors, trust our youth leaders, trust the church in general to be a safe place. It's not until fairly recently, I mean, the last 20 some years, that it's really been exposed that there's just a lot of darkness that's crept into the church and predators. Jude warns about it, just only one chapter, but verse 4, that certain men have crept in unnoticed, using the grace of God as a license for immorality. So the church, Christian activities, Christian locations, were a soft target. And so I think that's one of the reasons you see predators coming in.
Yeah, I really do see the soft target because there's this attitude of brotherhood. Like you're showing respect to your elders. You're being conditioned to hug everybody, even if it doesn't feel good. And having been a survivor myself, I really didn't like anybody touching me, but I felt like in order to be a good Christian, I kind of had to. And I know that that was played off on my children. They were pastors' kids. They had to, greet everybody with a hug. They had to be gracious all the time. And we kind of then turn off our warning systems.
Yes. We hear about that a lot, actually, and even in completely different settings. But even in people we know that were MKs, missionary kids over in foreign countries, with the field council, the other missionaries who are there in their area, they were uncle so-and-so and aunt so-and-so. They try to make it a family. And I get why you want a family setting, but it sets kids up and even vulnerable adults if you've got a predator in the midst. I think this is one of the reasons it's so important to do what we're doing is so folks understand that there are dangers even within churches and even our own families.
Yeah, and even with the dating culture, you can still have the abusive relationships and the imbalance of power. Right. And especially if the two individuals dating have an imbalance already with one being older or one being in a position of authority and one being underneath that position of authority, like a teacher, a student, a counselor, a client. Those types of situations just lend themselves to abuse. And so it's not just solely courtship that can lead to abusive relationships. I think we need to start talking about healthy relationships in our youth groups so that they can recognize this is healthy, this is not healthy, this is abuse, and actually bring out the domestic violence chart that says these are abusive behaviors so that kids can recognize that before they get into those relationships. And then they can say, oh, this isn't very respectful, before they get into a dangerous type of relationship.
Yeah, so back to your story, Sarah, and this is kind of a unique situation. So Faith and I have talked with a lot of survivors. We've talked with a lot of mom and dads, but not necessarily have the opportunity to do this together. So this is really cool that you guys are here. And obviously, this was a very painful journey. It sounds like in the beginning, the youth pastors talk about purity culture, and it sounds like he's saying a lot of good things. And so church seems good, life seems pretty good. So maybe for Rusty and Suzi, either one of you can, and maybe both respond to this. When did you begin to understand it wasn't the way you had thought it was going to be?
Go ahead. I think you recognized it first.
So that's hard because there was an age difference by quite a few years, 12 years. And we were not at the church very long when he made it a point to be at our house a lot. We thought it was because we had a house full of teenagers. Yeah. I didn't realize that he was focusing in on Sarah. I didn't catch that right away. But then he started making comments and like husband-wife comments, like she would be a great wife. Yeah. She's really special. And we were hearing that a lot about how special, how she was going to be very beneficial in the ministry, that she had all the things, like she was so mature for her age. She was so smart, which she is. Right. And she was. Right. But he definitely was honestly grooming us from the very beginning. It asked us to be part of the youth as leaders so that we would be at every event. And I can look back now and say, oh, that was a setup. Right. But at the time, it felt honoring. Yeah. And it stroked our egos. Yes. You hear how wonderful your daughter is and how awesome your kids are. And we want you to participate in this and we don't want you to miss out on this. And the church culture was all about getting the youth involved and having them up front. And so I would sit in church on Sunday with my 4 kids on the front row and pat myself on the back. What a great mom I am. I've got my kids in ministry already, and they're, barely 16, 14, 12, and 8. As he started to approach that, it didn't seem too strange, but I was a little uncomfortable with the age. Unfortunately, in our community, there was a lot of age difference in marriages. My husband had several in his own family, so they weren't alarmed by the age. So it took a little while, and then I started having misgivings after he had approached us about, I think Sarah's supposed to be my wife. And I was like, well, down the road. Like, oh, someday. Yeah. And that timeline kept getting moved up, and there seemed to be more pressure for that. And I got uncomfortable. Yeah. And I started to challenge that. And I remember being like shut down by him, by everyone. Everyone was like, no, there's nothing wrong with this. This is great.
Yeah, I think it's funny, if I can just chime in real quick. These are conversations, right, that we have had some conversation, but not always a lot. So I feel like there's always new information because I was 14, 15, 16, 17, like not really present. And when I hear Dad, when he said that, well, courtship, when I say betrothal versus courtship, and that courtship was like still opportunity to say no, right? Yes. That was not my experience of it. And now as I'm hearing Mom kind of go through the pieces of kept pushing, like, well, slow this down. And then he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing that timeline pretty quickly into it. I felt like there was no. I felt like I tried to exercise that no or pause or wait.
Because there were times that we asked, are you sure this is okay? And Sarah didn't feel the opportunity to say, no, it's not okay. I want out. And because I know that there's more than one time I asked that, but she just didn't feel, the way that she was.
Well, there was one time we had gone on a ministry trip to Israel, right? So I was out of the country for 10 days, right? 10-day break, nice. And you guys had said, while you're there, give it some time, think through this. If you don't want this, when you come back. And while I was there, I was kind of like, I don't think I want this, right?
And back home, he was in my house every day pressing. Yeah. Has she said anything? Wow.
And when you came to pick me up at the airport, well, all of us, there was a group of vans because there were a lot of people, but you were one of the drivers. He was there. Yes. And he sat in the van with me. I can't remember his hand on my thigh or like holding my hand. If I'd wanted to have a conversation with my parents to say, I don't want this to happen, he was not going to let that happen. Yep.
So he was manipulating right from the very beginning that you wouldn't have alone time with your parents to think about this or to communicate your doubts because he wanted to control your thinking
Right.
and your feelings and all of that. Conversations of Hope extends beyond this podcast. Michelle and I are available to speak at women's, youth, church, and community events.
We offer presentations on abuse prevention, healing, and empowerment.
To learn more about our speaking engagements and personal coaching and support services, visit our website, conversationsofhopepodcast.org.
Together, we can inspire change and promote healing in your community.
And I think there's some spiritual abuse that comes in here, and I think that's probably a pretty good topic to bring up for a minute. Because I remember as a pastor, and even after we started ministry, I'm hearing the term spiritual abuse, and I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. But and our simple definition is when you use God or the Bible to control or manipulate somebody else, that's spiritual abuse. And it sounds like there was a sense here of, Sarah, you being told, and I think mom and dad too, that this is God's will.
Oh, most definitely. What had happened, he actually said that God had given him a vision. And I remember parts of him describing that, how this was absolutely God's will for his life was to marry Sarah, our daughter. I mean, he made that clear. God was speaking. And this was the youth pastor and the worship leader who often had the microphone on Sundays to give prophetic words to people. He was the in-house prophet.
And he
so to
was
speak.
very charismatic. I mean, he really was.
And at the same time, when he did approach us and talk to us about Sarah being his wife, I know my initial reaction was, well, first of all, she has to be okay with that. And secondly, we have to make sure it's okay with the church. We have to go to the pastors and the elders to make sure it's okay. His dad was an elder. And he had a relationship with the pastor. Rusty and I went to that meeting and we shared what he had brought to us. The only thing they said was, well, give it 6 months and see if he still feels that way.
Yeah.
That was what they put in place.
But there was no enforcement of that.
No, there was none.
There was no follow-up. And we had set in place many things like no touching. They couldn't go anywhere alone, which was broken on the New York side or on his side. Sarah says things started right away, even in our own house. We had 3 other children running around.
No, we had 5 other.
Well, 5 other, that's right, foster children. And still,
That's one of the things we found out after we started our ministry in 2008. With an offender, there is no safe place, which really blew my mind. You would always think, in my mind, before we started ministry, that an offender's just going to be alone in the dark someplace. But in family get-togethers in crowded rooms, abuse happens a lot. We hear from a lot of survivors.
Honestly, we thought we were doing everything we could to protect her. You asked, when did you start to... I always had little misgivings. And yeah, I didn't feel like I had a voice. And when I did try, I got shut down really fast.
Yeah. And that's one of the dangerous things. It's one thing for me to say, I really believe that God's telling me I should do this. But when somebody says, this is God's will for you, and you're not sensing that, that's a lot of pressure on you. And so that's always hanging over your head that, well, so-and-so says it's God's will for me. And it's difficult, especially for a child.
Well, and there was a lot of manipulation around that too, right? Don't you feel this too? Look at this sign, look at this confirmation, right? All of these, innuendos and kind of half messages just to try to confirm you see this too.
Right.
You feel this too. I don't deny that I was 100% convinced that this is what God was showing me.
Yeah.
This is God's will.
And he did the same with us. Like if we started to question or doubt, it was like, oh, you're just afraid. If somebody said something that they didn't agree with it, he was so fast to defend.
Right.
And then challenge our faith.
Yes.
Oh, you're letting the enemy scare you away from something that God really wants.
Which is a perfect example of spiritual abuse.
yes, exactly.
Yep.
And so
And that's one of the things that makes me the most angry if I was to say, is the spiritual abuse, because what it has done to our family and to my daughter and changed her trajectory so much in this life that it has taken so many years for her to recover that back, and knowing that God is still good because you use God to have your own fleshly, lustful things done, and you use God to get there.
Yes. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot when we're at conferences or in churches is, why didn't God stop the abuse? Why didn't God, strike the abuser dead? And I actually shared with the group of pastors we met with this afternoon that part of the answer to that question is, I think when we stand before God as pastors and church leaders, that God's going to ask us, why didn't you stop the abuse?
Yeah.
If you think about the parables where Jesus talked about the master going into a far country, there's several different versions that he told of that. But there's one in Matthew 24, verses 45 to 51, and then a parallel passage in Luke, where the master gives the servants authority over the household, but they're supposed to feed the household, take care of the household. And Jesus said when he comes back, if the servant's done that, then he's going to be blessed and God's going to give him authority over cities and whatever. But they says, but if that evil servant says in his heart, my master's place is coming, and begins to beat the men servants and the maid servants, and to eat and drink from the drunkard, when the master comes back, he's going to cut him in two. Now, the image of that is Jesus, because he's the master gone to the far country, taking a sword and hacking an offender to pieces because of what they've done to his children. And when I'm preaching through those passages from the pulpit, I bring that out now in great detail. The same with the Matthew 18 passage, where he talks about it better if millstone were hung around your neck and drowned in the sea. Jesus doesn't say in that verse, better than what? But the implication is, and he's talking to those offending children or harming children, better than when I get my hands on you because of what I'm going to do to you. It would have been better for you to have millstone around your neck.
Yes.
So God cares deeply about abuse, but he's left us in charge. We're supposed to be the ones watching out. It's not just protecting children, it's a lot more, but that's a big part of it.
And I think, too, that God did intervene because she didn't end up having to marry him. And that, just the fact that he got sick and was...
Faith, I take all the credit for that. I really do. I believe because I prayed every day. And because I had that check in my spirit, I prayed, God, if you don't want this, you intervene. When he called off the wedding, I remember, Sarah was heartbroken and I was so sorry. And inside I'm, yes, yay. I'm so relieved he's out of her life.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I might have dropped the ball a little bit, because I didn't really make sure she was okay. I was just so relieved we didn't have to do that.
So let's follow up on that for just a minute. So from that point, the wedding's called off. How long was it before you began to realize just how wounded Sarah was, if that's an okay way to put it?
I honestly did not know until she disclosed to us in 2019 how bad it was.
Okay.
I really disliked him for what he put her through and the way he ended the relationship and the way he used God to say, oh, an angel appeared to me while I was on my deathbed and suddenly I can't marry you. I didn't believe that for a minute. And then he disappeared, and then he wanted to come back and he was going to apologize, and he didn't apologize. So he never owned what he put her through. And I was angry at that. I felt that was abusive. That was cruel and mean-spirited. But I was glad he was out of her life. But when she disclosed what had happened, that was a whole nother level of anger.
So was this a few years later?
No, it would have been decades.
And when that happened, of course, just a huge amount of guilt and shame just fell upon us as parents, and how we sacrificed our daughter. That sexual idolatry, not knowing on purpose, obviously, but that's still the case. And so it's taken years for us to be able to get back. And Sarah would disclose some now that she disclosed a little bit more. And she was very kind and wonderful to us. So we were able to work through that and now continue to have the relationship we have now in doing this together, I am told is a rarity, and I just don't quite understand why you would not back your child at that time. But the guilt and the shame, I finally came to the realization that I needed that forgiveness. And of course, we've asked Sarah multiple times. I still want to say it. And even though I know she's totally forgiven me, the thing with God and forgiveness from God, I used to think I'd have to ask forgiveness for myself because I couldn't let myself off the hook, right? And it wasn't that. What I really believe it is in my heart is accepting what Jesus Christ has already done on the cross. He's already done that.
Yeah.
And I have to accept it. And until I accept it, I won't put myself off the hook. I won't feel that forgiveness. I know there's going to be people that say we're stupid. I agree with them. There's going to be people that say, how could you do that? I have said bad things to myself as much as anybody else is going to say it. So go ahead. Because I agree. But I also agree that Jesus Christ has saved me from that, and he rescued my daughter. And for that, I am just so thankful. As I was praying before we came here tonight, God reminded me of that Japanese thing with the vases, right? When a vase is broken,
yes.
and how they put that back together, and then they put the gold along where the breaks are, and how that vessel is still being able to be used and actually more valuable. And I really feel that is, sometimes the Christian life, right? We're so broken, and we're broken in so many pieces. And if we allow God to put us back together again, we can be valuable again. And Sarah, to me, is very valuable. She's just a wonderful person, right? And God did that. I didn't do that. God did that. And as he puts all of us together as one, we can be a vessel for honor.
So when I think back, we talked on our earlier podcast on grooming and how that offenders groom everybody in the whole situation. They groomed you as her parents and her, and then the church community to accept this as God's will. And then whenever you had questions, they were really shut down quickly so that you were accepting and trusting. You want to be trusting of the people around you in your life, especially church leaders. When looking back, you can see the grooming, but at the time, you don't see that as grooming.
No.
You're just being trusting, and you're trusting that this is what God wants. And then when you look back, you can have the 20/20 vision. Oh yeah, I should have seen that. I should have known that. But at the time, you don't see that because you're being manipulated to come up with the same ideas that the person is that's trying to force this relationship. And if the motivations, if courtships or dating is right, if the motivation is right, it works out.
Right.
But if the motivation is wrong and there's evil intent, then it's not going to work. And that's the situation here. Even if only one person has evil motivations and evil intent, everybody can be drawn in. And then everybody thinks, if you're saying, whoa, then you're the one that has a problem and an issue.
And I think also when you are feeling a conflict, and that's one of the things I wished I would have acted on sooner, is there was a conflict inside, right? And I really believe that was Holy Spirit telling me something's wrong, right? And if you have a conflict, I just like to say to anybody, if you have a conflict, you need to pause. I don't care what anybody would say, but the right thing would have been is to pause, right? Okay, I got to work this conflict out because there's still there's something inside of me that's just saying that, hey, there's a problem. And we push that away, and we get told that, no, that's not it. That's the enemy. That's this, that's that. But it's like, you need to pause.
I wanted to address what Faith had said because, yes, we were all groomed. And I'm sure that the church, the youth group all say they were groomed. They all fell for it, right?
So I'm still friends with the majority of the youth group that was part of it. It was an amazing experience being part of that youth group, which is why I went back to that church afterwards to be with my friends, my peers. But they all reiterate the experience of feeling like they were witnessing this being presented as God has said she's going to be his wife, and then I'm gone. left the community and snatched away, as some have said. And their bells and whistles were going off too.
Right.
And they were like, we don't understand. And some, even when they did make a comment about it, we're told, oh, but that's God. You don't understand God. And don't question God.
And that's what I was going to say. Even though there was grooming involved in the whole community, we had trusted our leaders by going to them first and then expecting them to step in and do something if something was off. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say on that, like, you would expect, I feel like it would be a natural expectation that this person was in leadership, a pastor, that there would have been very clear cut, this is what this is going to look like. Here are the consequences if this is not followed.
Right.
And then very clear communication
Yeah.
to everybody involved.
Yeah. And to check in.
And what was happening was they were having alarms from other people or whatever, and they were being challenged, but not including us in the conversation, doing it behind the scenes and cutting us out of the discussion. And I remember being very angry about that. Like, if there's something going on, I need to know.
Right.
And I mean, that went to our own family, that was with our leadership. And then when Sarah came to us and she wrote the letter to the church and we took it to the elder board and read it with them, they didn't take any responsibility. Yeah. And that was heartbreaking.
Yes.
And to this day, that's probably one of my biggest wrestling points, is that what they could have done and should have done, they didn't do, even 2 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, and
Even after having programs.
even after having you guys come in and educate and bringing in the materials and sitting on the board and changing policies and procedures, they still didn't understand their part
Yeah.
and wouldn't take responsibility for their part. I know some parents don't side with the victim. They side with the church. We are more than willing to take responsibility for our part, and our part was big. And we're taking responsibility for it. And it's painful and it's shameful, but it's necessary for growth and improvement. The only way that we will protect anybody is to speak out.
Yes, exactly. And that's what's so valuable when abuse survivors are able to have the strength and the courage. Because it's not something that's pleasant. But yet,
I know.
you're doing it partially for your own healing, but you're doing it in a lot of ways to protect others.
And that's what advocates are doing. And I think of you guys and what you have to hear every time you go out and speak. And the people that you make relationships with are people that have been through the worst life has to offer. It really is the worst. And my heart goes out to you and what you do, but we need more advocates. We need more support.
And as Dad was talking about asking for forgiveness and going through that process, what I will point out to you is it's been more than just asking for forgiveness. It's been more than just saying a prayer. It's been action. It's been showing up. It's been sitting with me, hearing me disclose, holding my hand, hugging me,
Yes.
being there for the things, like being at the events, prelim, checking in, like all the action behind it is really what has been
That's
so
amazing.
healing.
Our time today is up, but Rusty, Suzi, and Sarah have agreed to stay with us and continue our conversation. So be sure to look for part 2 in the next episode of Conversations of Hope. We hope this episode of Conversations of Hope has been a source of comfort and inspiration.
Remember, you are not alone on this journey of healing.
Visit conversationsofhopepodcast.org for more resources and information.
Please subscribe or follow and share with those who might need this message of hope. Until next time, keep hope alive.